Hello, welcome to my channel. Today we're doing another white beard, but this time in color. My subject is Jeff Bridges in the role of Rooster Cogburn in the movie True Grit. I wanted to demonstrate how you can use a similar approach to drawing white beard as I did in some of my previous drawings, but this time with colored pencils. First, let's have a look at the technique that I used in the previous video when I was drawing Proximo from the Gladiator. So I just use a pointed stick to create some indentations in the paper, and these invisible lines become visible when I go over them with a pencil. Here I'm just going to use a brown pencil, it doesn't really matter. So when I go over these indentations, white lines start to appear. Of course, you need to create enough of them to make the beard look realistic. Then you can refine it a little bit, so you can use a Tutillion or some other blending tool to push the pigment a little bit into the paper. And you can also try to clean it up a little bit with an eraser. But one thing that you need to remember when drawing with colored pencils is that they are pretty difficult to erase. So that's something to keep in mind. Now we're going to have a look at the main part of the video. So I'm going to be starting with a couple of browns to do some work on his hat. And I'm going to be using a combination of colored pencils and pastel pencils. The reason why I'm using a little bit of pastel pencils is because they will allow me to cover large areas quickly, and they can also be blended more easily. But I'm mostly going to be using colored pencils, and I'm going to be using them on top of the pastel pencils. And for the face, I'm mostly going to be using colored pencils anyway. So that's one of the reasons why I wanted to make this video, to show you how you can create a nice looking white beard, even with a medium that's kind of difficult to erase and blend like colored pencils. But anyway, I've done much of the work on the top of his hat, and now I'm trying to put in some of these darker areas to give it some shape. I'm using a Prussian blue for the darker tones to put over the brown, and I'm going to be using that blue in some other areas of in some other parts of my drawing. As you can see, I'm also using a white colored pencil, but the only thing that I'm going to be using a white colored pencil for is blending or burnishing. So when I feel that some of these areas have too much texture and like too much of the grain of the paper is visible, I just go over it with a white colored pencil a little bit to blend it, and then I can go over it again with some darker pencils to create some more depth. Now I'm moving on to the rim of the hat, which is going to be a lot darker than the top part because it's facing away from the light source. So I'm going to be using a combination of dark brown and black for the rim of the hat, with the area just next to the head being the darkest. And again, here I used a combination of a pastel pencil and a colored pencil, just to make the blending easier. But most of it is fairly dark anyway, because like I said, it's facing away from the light source. Now I'm using a Van Dyke brown to work on the hair to the left of his face. Now his hair is mostly grey or greyish, but it's also a little bit darker, and it's not completely grey, and it's a little bit darker than his beard. Plus an additional reason why it has to be darker is because it's in the shadow, so it's going to appear a lot darker than the beard. So I'm putting some brown tones in it as well, and I'm also going to be using that in a combination with grey, but it's mostly going to be warm grey. So I did a little bit of work on his eye patch, and now moving on to the facial features using a combination of browns. Here I'm mostly using burnt umber and burnt sienna. Burnt umber being the darkest one that I'm going to be using here. And I'm just drawing some of these areas around his eyes and the nose and the mouth. Now the reason why I'm putting some of these darker portions first is because that will make my work a lot easier when I move on to drawing the beard. Because in order to use that technique of creating indentations with a stick, I have to have a better idea where the beard is going to be. In fact, I have to know exactly where it's going to be. So it requires a little bit of planning, and that is easier when you kind of frame the face and you know where to put everything. So now I'm using that pointed stick to start working on the mustache and the beard. And if you look at the top right corner, you will see my reference photo, and you will see in it that some parts of the face or some parts of the beard are kind of see-through. You can see more of the skin through them because more of the face is visible, because the beard or the facial hair is not as thick in those places. That's why I'm going to be putting down fewer of these lines in those areas. And in those areas where the beard appears very dense and almost white, I'm going to be putting most of these indentations. But even though I sped over this process a little bit and I'm showing it in time-lapse, it does take a little bit of patience and control so that you can really make the beard look good. And now I'm going over it with a cinnamon color just to establish a basic lighter tone, and I'm going to be going over that with some darker and warmer tones. And in this phase the beard and the mustache isn't really visible because there's not enough contrast, but once I start going over them with some darker colored pencils, the contrast will become more apparent and these white lines will begin to show up. So the area of the forehead under the rim of the head is very dark, so I'm using a combination of browns there, mostly burnt sienna and burnt umber. And for the eye patch I'm going to be using again a combination of brown and black, mostly Van Dyke brown and burnt umber and black, and a little bit of warm grey as well. And I'm going to burnish that with a white colored pencil. So now I'm using Venetian red to work on the second layer of the skin. I'm making it a little bit darker and shading some of these areas. And on top of that I'm using some burnt umber, and on top of that I'm using on top of the Venetian red I'm using some burnt sienna, and then on top of that I'm using burnt umber. So as you can see, I have a lot of these reddish tones here, and if I feel like I need to make some of these areas a little bit cooler, I'm gonna go over it either with some violet or some Prussian blue or some other of those colder but darker colors. For the eyes I use a little bit of that blue and black, and of course because the eye is all in the shadow I'm going to have to shade the eyeball a little bit more so that it's a lot darker. And he's kind of squinting in this picture. So now I'm shading around the nose, again mostly using Venetian red and burnt sienna. And just gradually building up the tone. There's a lot of wrinkles around the eyes which make him interesting to draw, and also which make my job a little bit easier. But you see now, as for the mustache and the beard, I'm not going to be going over those with brown or one of those reddish colors, because I want them to appear more gray. That's why I'm going over them with a warm gray. And for the edges of the mustache and the beard, I'm going to be using some of those skin tones, but on the beard and the mustache itself, I want to avoid using those skin tones, and I'm mostly going to be using that warm gray. The same one that I used for the hair, but in a combination with a brown. That's why the hair, like I said, is going to be quite a bit darker than the beard. So the beard is mostly going to appear light gray and almost white in certain areas. And like I said, I'm using a lot of these reddish tones and reddish browns. That's because that's what I saw in my reference photo. Maybe it was because of the lighting or whatever, but they did appear kind of reddish to me. That's why I picked these tones. So I just added just a few more of these white lines under his lower lip, and now I'm shading the area under the chin and around the neck. But like I said, over the beard and the mustache, I'm mostly using warm gray and just a little bit of brownish tones on the edges of it. And now you can see how the beard is finally starting to show up, because in order for these white lines to show up, obviously you need a lot more contrast, because you can't expect for the white hairs to show up when you cover that area with a very light color. It needs to be darker so that some of them would stand out. Now obviously in charcoal, when you're working in charcoal, this is quite a bit easier in my opinion, because charcoal is easier to manipulate and it's easier to fix mistakes and to erase certain things, and therefore it's easier to refine the appearance of the beard. That's why when you're working with colored pencils, you need to keep in mind that erasing is going to be a problem, and that in that first stage, when you're creating those indentations, you need to be a little bit more patient, and you need to do a little more planning, so that the lines that you lay down are really going to look good once you go over them with a colored pencil, because once you do that, there's going to be very little you can do to fix it. So I've mostly done the left side of the face, or his right, and now moving on to the other side of the face and the hair here on the right. I really need to shade this area under the beard and under the chin a little bit darker. So the beard kind of looks a little bit like a goatee, because it's a lot more dense on the tip of the chin, and there's kind of less of it around the cheeks. That's why I'm kind of trying to make it look like more of the skin is showing through the beard on the sides of the face and on the cheeks. So the biggest part of this video, as you can see, is going to be mostly me working on the face and the beard, because that's what I think most people who watch this will find interesting. So I'm just doing a little bit more shading on the ears and around the ears. and I'm using a pencil eraser just to try to pull some highlights on the skin, make some parts of the face just a little bit lighter so that they kind of stand out a little bit more. And by the way, if you're not entirely happy with the appearance of your beard, you can always add a few touches of a white gel pen over it. Even though when I use a gel pen, I use it very sparingly, just a few touches here and there for some of these flyaway white hairs, but most of the time I tend to prefer this indentation technique with a pointed stick. If you feel like the beard needs to be a little bit more dense and you haven't created enough of these indentations in certain areas, you just erase that a little bit with a pencil eraser, and it becomes lighter and more white, and you get the illusion that these white hairs are a little bit more dense in that area. But like I said, I used a little bit of the white gel pen here and there, but it's mostly, this white beard is mostly a result of making those indentations. The gel pen, I don't really recommend it. You can use it very sparingly, and like I said, just to pull a few flyaway hairs here and there where it would be difficult to erase them, because when you try to erase colored pencils, it's really difficult to get clean shapes and clean edges. So now I'm going to be moving on to the clothes and finishing the drawing. Obviously this took a little bit more time in real time, but I'm going to speed up the time lapse here a little bit more. He has a bluish scarf here, and I use that same blue in some other parts of my drawing, which is always a good idea to use a color in different parts of the drawing. And here my camera went a little bit blurry for some reason, but just to explain what I was doing here, I used a little bit of vine charcoal for his coat. And the reason why I used vine charcoal and not the colored pencils is not only because it's a lot quicker, but because I'm creating a vignette and I want the lower portions of this drawing to kind of fade towards the edge, which is why charcoal was more suitable than the colored pencils. It would be a lot more difficult to create that fading effect with colored pencils than it is with charcoal. That's why I used a bit of charcoal as a base, and then I went over it with colored pencils to add some more shadings and shape and some texture as well, because I want a really rough looking texture, like it's a worn out coat. But the focus of the drawing obviously is not the clothes, it's the beard. A few words about the movie perhaps. It's a newer version of the movie with the same name. The first one, the first True Grit, was had John Wayne in the main role, and in this one it's Jeff Bridges. I thought it was a very good movie, and now I'm kind of wrapping up this drawing by just adding in some of these darker areas and cleaning up some of these folds in the clothes a little bit. Just adding a few final touches before I sign the drawing. And here it is. So that's what the beard looks like when you use that indentation technique in combination with colored pencils. I hope you like the way it turned out. Let me know what you think in the comments. I've zoomed in a little bit so that you can see more of the detail. As you can see, it looks pretty good. And I zoomed out so that we can see the whole drawing once again. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to check out my other videos and to subscribe. Bye for now.